The rain hammered down on Marie Douglas as she stumbled across the finish line, her grandson's jersey clinging to her 70-year-old frame like a second skin. The crowd at the Ironman 70.3 in Boulder, Colorado erupted as she collapsed into the arms of race volunteers, her weathered hands still gripping the handlebars of her borrowed bike. Through the chaos of cheering spectators and camera flashes, Marie's mind flashed back to the hospital room 18 months ago, where she'd promised a dying boy that she would finish what he couldn't. The race officials had laughed when she first registered, telling her that triathlon was a young person's sport, that someone her age had no business attempting 1.2 miles of swimming, 56 miles of cycling, and 13.1 miles of running. But as Marie lifted her arms in triumph, rain streaming down her face, mixing with tears of joy and exhaustion, she knew that some promises are worth more than logic. The clock read 8 hours and 47 minutes, well past the cutoff time. But nobody seemed to care about the rules anymore. Standing there in the Colorado rain, Marie felt the weight of every training session, every early morning swim, every painful mile on the bike. She thought about the small town of Durango where this journey began, about the retirement home where her friends thought she'd lost her mind, about the grief counselor who said she was processing her loss in an unhealthy way. The race announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, at 70 years old, Marie Douglas has just completed her first triathlon in honor of her grandson, Tommy Martinez, who passed away before he could fulfill his dream of finishing this very race. The crowd's cheers grew louder, but Marie barely heard them as she clutched Tommy's race number to her chest. This wasn't just about crossing a finish line, it was about keeping a promise to the boy who taught her that age is just a number, and that sometimes the most important victories happen when everyone expects you to quit. What you're about to hear is the story of how a retired nurse from a small Colorado town transformed grief into purpose, proving that it's never too late to chase someone else's dream and make it your own. This is about more than just swimming, biking, and running. It's about the power of love to push us beyond what we thought possible, about finding strength in the darkest moments, and about how sometimes the finish line is just the beginning of something beautiful. Marie's journey from that hospital bedside to the triathlon finish line will take you through the mountains of Colorado, into the heart of American determination, and show you that the most powerful competitor isn't always the fastest or the strongest, but the one who refuses to give up. Hello my friends, before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Durango, Colorado sits nestled in the San Juan Mountains, a town where the altitude makes your lungs burn and the winters can break your spirit if you're not careful. Marie Douglas had called this place home for 43 years, ever since she'd moved here fresh out of nursing school to work at Mercy Regional Medical Center. The town of 18,000 people was the kind of place where everyone knew your business, where the local diner served the same green chili every Thursday, and where retirement meant fishing on the Animas River or tending to a garden that fought against the short growing season. Marie had always been content with this rhythm, raising her daughter Sarah as a single mother after her husband died in a construction accident. Watching the seasons change from her modest ranch house on the east side of town, at 68, she'd been living the quiet life of a widow, babysitting her grandson, Tommy, on weekends and attending the Methodist church where she'd sung in the choir for 2 decades. Tommy Martinez was everything Marie had hoped for in a grandson. Sarah's boy carried the best of both his Mexican father's passion and his grandmother's stubborn determination. At 19, he was a sophomore at Fort Lewis College, studying exercise science and training for triathlons with a single-minded focus that reminded Marie of herself when she was working double shifts in the ICU. The kid was lean and fast, with his father's dark eyes and his grandmother's iron will, spending his summers lifeguarding at the Durango Community Recreation Center and his winters training in the college's pool. Abuela, I'm gonna do the Boulder 70.3 next year, he'd announced one Sunday after church, his face glowing with the kind of excitement that only comes from having a dream bigger than yourself. Marie had watched him train, driving him to bike rides in the foothills, timing his runs along the river trail, never fully understanding why someone would voluntarily put themselves through such torture. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in March, when the last snow of winter made the roads treacherous and visibility poor. Tommy had been driving to his job at the rec center when a pickup truck ran a stop sign on Main Avenue, T-boning his Honda Civic and sending both vehicles spinning into a snowbank. Marie got the call at 6:47 a.m. Sarah's voice broken and barely recognizable. "Mum, you need to get to the hospital now. Tommy's hurt real bad." The next 72 hours blurred together in a haze of medical terminology that Marie understood all too well. Machines beeping, Sarah crying, and Tommy fighting for his life in the same ICU where Marie had worked for 20 years. The doctor's colleagues who'd become friends over the decades couldn't meet her eyes when they explained about the traumatic brain injury, the internal bleeding, the slim chances of recovery. Marie held Tommy's hand through it all, whispering prayers and promises, watching his chest rise and fall with mechanical precision. On the third day, Tommy opened his eyes for the last time, his voice barely a whisper as he gripped Marie's hand with surprising strength. "A boiler, I was so close to being ready for Boulder," he said, his words slurred but his message clear. "I had my training plan all mapped out. My bike was tuned up. I even had my race gear picked out." Marie squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses from countless hours on the bike, the swimmer's shoulders that had made him so proud. "I know, mijo," she whispered back, using the Spanish endearment that always made him smile. "You would have been amazing out there." Tommy's eyes focused on her with an intensity that cut through the morphine haze. "Promise me something, abuela. Promise me, you'll finish it for me. I know you think I'm crazy, but you're stronger than you know. Promise me you'll cross that finish line." Marie felt something break open in her chest, a mixture of grief and determination that would change everything. "I promise, Tommy. I promise I'll finish your race." The funeral was held at the Methodist Church on a gray Thursday morning. The entire town seemingly packed into the wooden pews that had witnessed generations of joy and sorrow. Marie sat in the front row, wearing her best black dress and clutching the race registration packet that Tommy had printed out but never submitted. Reverend Williams spoke about young lives cut short, about the mystery of God's plan, about how Tommy's spirit would live on in the hearts of those who loved him. But Marie barely heard the words, her mind already turning over the impossible promise she'd made to a dying boy. Sarah held her hand during the service, both women crying for different reasons. Sarah, for the son she'd lost, Marie for the mission she'd accepted. When the mourners filed past the casket, Marie slipped Tommy's training schedule into her purse, a small act of rebellion against the finality of death. The reception was held in the church basement, filled with green chili and casseroles, college friends sharing stories of Tommy's dedication to his sport, his infectious enthusiasm for life, his dreams of maybe making it to the Olympics someday. As the last mourners filtered out into the Colorado afternoon, Marie found herself alone in the church basement, staring at the photo display that Sarah had put together. Pictures of Tommy swimming, biking, running, always with that huge grin that made you believe anything was possible. "Mrs. Douglas." The voice belonged to Coach Peterson from the college, a grizzled man in his 50s who'd been working with Tommy on his triathlon training. "I just wanted to say how sorry I am. Tommy was special, you know? He had that thing you can't teach, he just wouldn't quit, no matter how much it hurt." Marie looked up at this man who understood her grandson's passion better than she ever had. "He made me promise something before he died," she said quietly. "He made me promise I'd finish the Boulder 70.3 for him. I know it sounds crazy, but I gave my word." Coach Peterson studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. "Tommy talked about you all the time, said you were the toughest person he knew. If you're serious about this, if you really want to honor his memory this way, then I'll help you get ready. But it's gonna be the hardest thing you've ever done." The next morning, Marie woke up in her empty house and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. She pulled on an old pair of sneakers and walked to the mailbox, where she dropped off the registration form for the Boulder 70.3, along with a check for $275 that represented most of her monthly entertainment budget. The postmark read, March 15, 2023, and the race was scheduled for August 12, exactly 5 months to turn a 68-year-old retired nurse into a triathlete. As she walked back to the house, Marie felt the weight of Tommy's promise settling on her shoulders like a pack she'd carry for the rest of her life. The neighbors were already talking. She could see Mrs. Patterson peering through her curtains, probably wondering why the Douglas woman was up so early, why she looked so determined. Marie didn't care what they thought. She had work to do, a promise to keep, and a grandson who was counting on her to do the impossible. The Durango Community Recreation Center had been Tommy's second home, and walking through its doors felt like stepping into a shrine of chlorine and echoing voices. Marie stood at the edge of the pool at 5:30 a.m., watching the early morning lap swimmers cut through the water with the kind of efficiency that seemed as foreign as speaking Mandarin. She'd learned to swim as a child in the irrigation ditches outside town, but that had been 60 years ago, and the 25-yard lanes stretching out before her might as well have been the Pacific Ocean. "You sure about this, Marie?" asked Janet, the lifeguard who'd worked with Tommy and remembered when Marie used to bring him for swim lessons 15 years earlier. "The water's cold, and swimming's different than you remember." Marie nodded, her grandmother's determination overriding her common sense. Tommy always said the water was the hardest part. "If I can't handle the swim, I can't handle the race." She wore a one-piece swimsuit that she'd bought at Walmart, navy blue and practical. Nothing like the sleek gear she'd seen on Tommy's teammates. Her first lap was a disaster of splashing and gasping, her body fighting against the water instead of moving through it. The young college swimmers in the fast lane glided past her like dolphins, while Marie struggled to remember how to breathe properly, how to coordinate her arms and legs, how to ignore the burning in her lungs that reminded her of the altitude she'd somehow forgotten after 4 decades in Colorado. By the time she'd managed one length of the pool, Marie was hanging on the wall, chest heaving, wondering if she'd made the stupidest decision of her life. "That's normal," said a voice behind her. She turned to see Coach Peterson, already dressed in his workout clothes, holding a clipboard and wearing the patient expression of someone who'd seen this before. Tommy couldn't make it 50 yards when he first started. "Swimming's about technique, not strength. You got the strength, Murray. I watched you work double shifts for 20 years. Now we just gotta teach your body how to use it." The words hit her like a challenge, and Marie pushed off the wall for another lap, this time focusing on the rhythm instead of the speed. The biking was a different kind of humiliation, played out on the mountain roads that Tommy had conquered with ease. Marie's old beach cruiser was a joke compared to the sleek road bikes she'd seen at the race shop. But it was what she had, and she was determined to make it work. The first ride lasted exactly 12 minutes before her legs gave out on the hill leading to the college, forcing her to walk the bike back home while cars passed with what felt like judgment. "You need proper equipment," Sarah had said, when Marie called to report on her progress. "Mom, this is getting expensive, and I'm worried you're gonna hurt yourself." But Marie had already done the math in her head. If she ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch instead of going to the diner, if she skipped her monthly hair appointment, if she sold some of the antique dishes that had been gathering dust since her husband died, she could afford a used road bike and some basic gear. "Your son believed in me," she told Sarah firmly. "The least I can do is believe in myself." The running was where Marie discovered that 68-year-old knees remember every flight of stairs you've ever climbed, every double shift you've ever worked, every mile you've ever ignored in favor of sitting down. Her first attempt at jogging around the block ended with her sitting on the curb, wondering if the sharp pain in her chest was a heart attack or just the cruel reminder that she hadn't run anywhere in 20 years. "Start with walking," Coach Peterson advised when she showed up at the pool the next morning, limping slightly. Build up slowly. Your body's not used to this kind of stress. Marie wanted to argue, to push harder, to make up for lost time, but the pain in her joints was a reality check that couldn't be ignored. She started walking the route that Tommy used to run, from her house to the river trail and back, timing herself with an old stopwatch and feeling like she was moving backward instead of forward. The other runners who passed her were mostly college kids, their legs pumping with the kind of easy rhythm that made Marie feel every one of her years. After 2 weeks of training, Marie had lost 3 pounds and gained a collection of bruises, sore muscles, and a newfound respect for anyone who'd ever called themselves an athlete. The swimming was slowly improving. She could now complete 4 laps without stopping, which felt like a victory, even though she needed to swim 84 laps for the race. The biking remained a struggle, her old beach cruiser feeling more inadequate. With each ride, she'd managed to complete a 5-mile route without stopping. The running was still mostly walking, but she was covering longer distances and feeling slightly less like she was going to die. "You're making progress," Coach Peterson assured her during one of their regular check-ins. "Tommy didn't become a triathlete overnight, and neither will you. But you're showing up every day, and that's half the battle." Marie nodded, but secretly she was terrified that 5 months wouldn't be enough, that she'd made a promise she couldn't keep to a boy who deserved better. The first real test came when Marie decided to attempt her first brick workout, a bike ride immediately followed by a run, simulating the race conditions that Tommy had described as like trying to run on jello legs. She'd managed a 10-mile bike ride, her longest yet, and transitioned to running with the confidence of someone who'd been training for a month. The result was humbling. Her legs felt like concrete, her breathing was ragged, and she managed exactly half a mile before she had to stop and walk, sitting on a park bench, watching college students jog past with their easy strides. Marie felt the weight of Tommy's promise crushing down on her. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself, tears mixing with sweat on her cheeks. "I'm almost 70 years old. I can't do this." But then she remembered Tommy's eyes in that hospital bed, the way he'd gripped her hand when he made her promise, the faith he'd shown in her when she couldn't even see it in herself. Marie stood up, wiped her eyes, and started walking again. If she couldn't run the whole way, she'd walk. If she couldn't walk fast, she'd walk slow. But she'd keep moving forward, one step at a time. Because some promises are worth more than pride. The breakthrough came at the end of her 6th week of training, when Marie finally managed to swim 500 yards without stopping. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't pretty, but she'd covered the distance, and Coach Peterson was there to witness it. "That's a quarter of the race distance," he said, genuine pride in his voice. "Tommy would be proud of you." Marie floated on her back in the pool, staring up at the fluorescent lights and feeling something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of earning something through pure effort. Her body was changing, muscles appearing in places she'd forgotten they existed, her endurance improving week by week. More importantly, her mind was changing, the constant grief over Tommy's death transforming into something more purposeful. She was still training for him, still keeping his promise. But now she was also training for herself, discovering a version of Marie Douglas that she'd never known existed. The race was still months away, but for the first time since Tommy's funeral, Marie allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could actually do this impossible thing. Summer in Durango brought the kind of heat that made training feel like punishment, and Marie's daily routine became a battle against both the elements and her own limitations. The pool was crowded with vacationing families, forcing her to share lanes with children who couldn't understand why the old lady was swimming so slowly. Her bike ride started at dawn to avoid the afternoon thunderstorms that rolled through the mountains, but even the early morning heat made her jersey stick to her back like a second skin. "You're looking stronger," Coach Peterson observed during one of their weekly check-ins. But Marie felt anything but strong as she struggled through another set of swimming drills. The race was now less than 3 months away, and the gap between her current abilities and what she'd need to complete 70.3 miles of swimming biking, and running felt as vast as the Colorado sky. Her swimming had improved to where she could complete 800 yards without stopping. But the 1.2-mile race distance still seemed impossible. Her biking was limited by her aging equipment and the mountains that surrounded every route, and her running remained more of a shuffle than the smooth stride she'd imagined. The first real crisis came when Marie attempted her longest bike ride yet, a 25-mile loop that would take her through the foothills and back. Testing both her endurance and her mental toughness, she'd been riding for about an hour when her old bike's chain snapped on a steep climb, leaving her stranded on a mountain road with no cell service and a growing awareness that her training budget hadn't included contingencies for equipment. Failures. A passing cyclist, a woman in her 30s with professional-grade gear, stopped to help, taking one look at Marie's ancient beach cruiser and shaking her head. "Ma'am, you really need a better bike if you're serious about this sport," she said, not unkindly but with the kind of directness that cut through Marie's pride. The woman gave Marie a ride back to town, and the conversation during that drive was a wake-up call about just how unprepared Marie really was. "Have you done any open water swimming?" the woman asked. "Because pool swimming is completely different from lake swimming, and your bike, well, you're gonna need something that won't break down on race day." That evening, Marie sat at her kitchen table with a calculator and a growing sense of panic, trying to figure out how to afford the equipment she needed without dipping into her emergency fund. A decent used road bike would cost at least $800. A wetsuit for the open water swim was another $200, and she still needed proper running shoes, cycling shorts, and a dozen other items she'd never considered. "Mum, this is getting out of hand," Sarah said when Marie called to discuss her options. "You've already spent more on this race than you spend on groceries in 6 months. Maybe it's time to admit that this was a nice idea, but it's not practical." The words stung because they echoed Marie's own doubts, but they also sparked something stubborn in her chest. "Your son believed I could do this," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "He saw something in me that I'm just starting to see in myself. I'm not giving up, Sarah. I'm gonna find a way to make this work." The solution came from an unexpected source, the Triathlon Club at Fort Lewis College, where Tommy had been a member before his accident. Coach Peterson had mentioned Marie's situation during a team meeting, and the college athletes had taken up a collection, pooling their spare gear and raising money for a used bike. "Tommy was our friend," explained Jessica, the team captain who'd trained with him for 2 years. "We want to help you finish what he started." The gesture left Marie speechless. Standing in the college's equipment room, surrounded by young athletes who were offering their support to a woman they barely knew. The bike they'd found was a 15-year-old Trek that had seen better days but was still infinitely superior to her beach cruiser. The wetsuit was borrowed from a graduated member who'd left it behind, and the running shoes came from the team's equipment manager who'd noticed Marie's worn sneakers during a pool session. "We're going to be cheering for you at the race," Jessica said as Marie tried on the wetsuit. "Tommy used to talk about his boiler all the time. He said you were the toughest person he knew." With better equipment came harder training, and Marie's body began to rebel against the increasing demands she was placing on it. A persistent pain in her left knee made running feel like torture, and she found herself popping ibuprofen like candy just to get through her daily workouts. The swimming was improving slowly, but the open water practice sessions at McPhee Reservoir were a nightmare of cold water, choppy waves, and the kind of disorientation that made her question whether she'd ever survive the race swim. "Open water is different," Coach Peterson explained as Marie struggled through her first 400-yard swim in the lake. "You can't see the bottom, there's no lane lines, and the water's cold even in summer. But Tommy trained in this same lake, and he learned to love it. You will too." Marie wasn't convinced, especially after a practice session where she'd panicked in the middle of the reservoir, treading water while fighting off claustrophobia and the urge to swim straight back to shore. Only Coach Peterson's calm voice from the kayak beside her had gotten her through the remaining distance. The physical challenges were matched by the emotional roller coaster of training through grief. Some days, Marie felt Tommy's presence so strongly that she could almost hear his voice encouraging her through difficult workouts. Other days, the weight of his absence made every step feel pointless, and she'd find herself crying in the pool, her tears mixing with the chlorinated water. Grief is like this, explained Dr. Martinez, the counselor that Sarah had insisted Marie seek. It comes in waves, and physical stress can make it worse. But what you're doing, channeling your grief into something positive that's actually healthy. Tommy would be proud of you for keeping your promise. Marie wanted to believe that, but the doubts crept in during the hardest moments of training. When her body screamed for rest and her mind whispered that a 69-year-old woman had no business attempting something so physically demanding. The race was now 6 weeks away, and Marie's longest swim was still only 1,000 yards. Her longest bike ride was 35 miles, and she'd never run more than 3 miles without stopping to walk. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal brick workout, when Marie attempted a 40-mile bike ride followed by a 6-mile run. The bike portion went reasonably well, but the transition to running was a disaster. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, her breathing was labored, and she'd barely covered half a mile when she stumbled and fell on the gravel trail, scraping her hands and knees badly enough to draw blood. Sitting on the ground, staring at her bloody palms and feeling the sting of failure, Marie almost called Sarah to admit defeat. "I can't do this," she whispered to the empty trail. "I'm not strong enough. I'm not young enough. I'm not Tommy." But as she sat there, feeling sorry for herself, a memory surfaced. Tommy in the hospital, his voice weak but determined, telling her that she was stronger than she knew. Marie stood up, brushed the gravel from her knees, and started walking. Again, if she couldn't run, she'd walk. If she couldn't walk fast, she'd walk slow. But she'd keep moving forward, because Tommy was counting on her to finish what he'd started. And some promises are worth bleeding for. Asterisk. The revelation came at 5:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late June, when Marie found herself alone in the pool, with nothing but her thoughts and the rhythm of her stroke. She'd been swimming for 45 minutes, lost in the meditation of repetitive motion. When she realized she'd completed 1,200 yards without stopping, exactly the race distance for the swimming portion of the triathlon, the achievement hit her like a physical blow, and she stopped mid-stroke, treading water in the deep end while tears streamed down her face. "Tommy," she whispered to the empty pool, "I think I can actually do this." The moment was a turning point, not just in her training, but in her understanding of what this journey had become. This wasn't just about keeping a promise to a dead grandson anymore. It was about discovering that Marie Douglas was capable of things she'd never imagined possible. At 69 years old, she was becoming an athlete, and the transformation was as surprising to her as it was to everyone watching. The change in Marie's status within the Durango community was subtle but undeniable. At first, people had whispered about the crazy old lady who thought she could complete a triathlon. But as the months passed and Marie's dedication became evident, the whispers turned to admiration. "Morning, Marie," called out the barista at the coffee shop where she'd started stopping after her bike rides. "How's the training going?" The question was asked with genuine interest, not mockery, and Marie realized that somewhere along the way, she'd become the town's unofficial inspiration. Local newspaper reporter Jake Morrison had asked to do a story about her journey, and the resulting article in the Durango Herald had brought support from unexpected places. "You're representing all of us," said Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who'd been watching Marie's morning training routine with growing respect, showing that it's never too late to chase a dream. The attention made Marie uncomfortable, but she understood that her story had become bigger than just keeping a promise to Tommy. The breakthrough in her biking came when Marie finally conquered the climb to Purgatory Resort, a 12-mile ascent that had defeated her twice before. The gradient was brutal, the altitude made her lungs burn, and her legs screamed for mercy with every pedal stroke. But this time, instead of giving up, Marie found a rhythm that allowed her to spin her pedals, slowly but steadily, accepting that she'd never be fast but knowing she could be persistent. The view from the top was spectacular. the San Juan Mountains stretching out in every direction, the valley floor thousands of feet below, and the sense of accomplishment that comes from earning a vista through pure effort. Tommy would have loved this, she said to herself, taking a photo to show Sarah later. The descent was terrifying but exhilarating, and Marie felt a confidence on the bike that she'd never experienced before. The 56-mile race distance was still daunting, but she now knew she could handle the climbs and the technical descents that had once seemed impossible. Her running transformation was the most gradual, but perhaps the most meaningful. Marie had never been a natural runner, but she'd developed a shuffling gait that ate up miles without destroying her joints. The key was accepting that her pace didn't matter. What mattered was forward progress. During a particularly long training run along the Animas River Trail, Marie found herself running behind a group of college students, listening to their conversation about classes and relationships and weekend plans. For a moment, she felt ancient, disconnected from their youthful energy. But then she remembered that she was doing something none of them had ever attempted. At 69, she was training for her first triathlon, pushing her body to limits she'd never tested, proving that age was just a number if you had the determination to ignore it. The realization gave her a burst of energy that carried her through the final 2 miles of the run. And she finished strong, feeling like she could have kept going. The emotional healing that accompanied Marie's physical transformation was unexpected, but profound. The daily training had become a form of meditation, a way to process her grief over Tommy's death, while creating something positive from the pain. "I dream about him sometimes," she told Coach Peterson during one of their weekly. "He's always young and healthy, and he's encouraging me to keep going. I wake up feeling like he's still with me." The coach nodded, understanding the psychology of athletic pursuit better than most. "Training does that," he explained. "It connects you to something bigger than yourself. Tommy's not gone, Marie. He's just taking a different form." The words resonated with Marie, who'd been struggling with the spiritual aspects of her journey. She'd always been a woman of faith, but Tommy's death had shaken her beliefs about God's plan and the fairness of life. Now, through the discipline of training, she was finding her way back to a faith that could accommodate both loss and hope. The most surprising discovery was how much Marie had come to love the sport itself. What had started as an obligation to a dying grandson had evolved into a genuine passion for the challenge of triathlon. She loved the early morning swims when the pool was empty and peaceful, the bike rides through mountain scenery that she'd lived near but never truly seen, and even the running, which had become a form of moving meditation. "I think I understand now why Tommy was so excited about this," she told Sarah during one of their weekly phone calls. "It's not just about the physical challenge, it's about proving to yourself that you can do hard things, that you can suffer and keep going, that you can push through barriers you thought were permanent." Sarah, who'd initially been skeptical of her mother's quest, was beginning to see the positive changes in Marie's outlook and energy. "You sound different, Mum," she said. "Stronger, more like yourself than you've been since Tommy died." The final piece of Marie's transformation came when she received an unexpected visitor, Tommy's former training partner, Carlos, who'd driven down from Boulder to check on her progress. "I heard you were doing the 70.3, he said, studying. Marie, with the appraising eye of a serious athlete. "Tommy used to talk about you all the time, said you were the toughest person in his family. I didn't really believe him until now." Carlos spent the afternoon training with Marie, offering technical advice and encouragement, but more importantly, sharing stories about Tommy's dedication and dreams. He was going to propose to his girlfriend after the race, Carlos revealed. Had it all planned out, he was going to wear the finisher's medal when he asked her. He was so excited about the future. The revelation made Marie's mission feel even more important, and she realized that she wasn't just completing Tommy's race, she was carrying his dreams forward, keeping his memory alive through the sport. He'd loved. As Carlos prepared to leave, he handed Marie a small package. "This was Tommy's," he said. "He'd want you to have it." Inside was Tommy's race number from the previous year's race. Faded, but still intact. and Marie knew she'd found the perfect way to honor his memory on race day. Race morning in Boulder arrived with the kind of crisp August air that makes the Rocky Mountains feel like the edge of the world, and Marie stood at the transition area at 5:15 a.m., her hands shaking as she arranged her gear with the methodical precision of someone who'd practiced this routine 100 times. The Boulder Reservoir stretched out before her like a gray mirror, its surface barely disturbed by the morning breeze, and Marie tried to ignore the fact that she'd never swum in water this cold or this deep. Tommy's race number was pinned to her jersey, faded but visible, and she touched it like a talisman as she pulled on the borrowed wetsuit that the college team had given her. Around her, 2,000 other athletes were going through their own pre-race rituals, but Marie felt completely alone in her fear and determination. "You got this, Marie," called out Jessica from the college team, who'd driven up to cheer her on. "Tommy's gonna be so proud." The words hit Marie like a physical blow, and she had to turn away to hide the tears that threatened to undermine her carefully constructed confidence. The swim start was a chaos of splashing bodies and thrashing arms, and Marie found herself in the middle of a washing machine of humanity, getting kicked and elbowed by swimmers half her age who treated the race like a contact sport. The water was shockingly cold despite the wetsuit, and Marie fought off panic as she struggled to find her rhythm in the churning mass of competitors. "Stay calm," she told herself, remembering Coach Peterson's advice about finding clear water and swimming her own race. After what felt like an eternity, the pack began to spread out, and Marie settled into the stroke that had carried her through countless training sessions. The first buoy seemed impossibly far away, but she focused on the hypnotic rhythm of her stroke, breathing every third stroke and trying to ignore the burning in her shoulders. Halfway through the swim, Marie realized she was actually enjoying herself. The water was clear. The mountains provided a stunning backdrop, and she was doing something she'd never imagined possible just 8 months earlier. The transition from swim to bike was where Marie's inexperience showed most clearly, and she fumbled with her gear while younger athletes flew past her with practiced efficiency. Her hands were numb from the cold water, making it difficult to zip up her cycling jersey and clip into her pedals, but she eventually got organized and rolled out onto the bike course with a mixture of relief and terror. The 56-mile route wound through the Colorado foothills, featuring climbs that made her training rides look like gentle warm-ups, and Marie settled into the grinding pace that had carried her through months of preparation. The first major climb came at mile 15, a brutal ascent that scattered the field and left Marie grinding up the hill in her easiest gear, her heart rate redlining but her legs still turning over. Spectators lined the steepest sections, cheering for every athlete, but Marie barely heard them over the sound of her own labored breathing and the voice in her head that sounded remarkably like Tommy. "You got this, abuela. Just keep the pedals." Moving the halfway point of the bike course provided a brief respite, and Marie allowed herself to enjoy the descent through a mountain valley that showcased Colorado's high country at its most spectacular. She'd been riding for over 2 hours, longer than any training ride she'd ever completed, but her legs felt surprisingly strong and her spirits were high. The aid stations were manned with volunteers who cheered for every athlete, and Marie found herself smiling and waving back, feeling part of something bigger than herself. "Looking strong," called out one volunteer as Marie grabbed a water bottle. But at mile 35, the sky began to darken with the kind of afternoon thunderheads that can turn a Colorado day dangerous in minutes. The first drops hit Marie's helmet, just as she was climbing the course's most challenging hill, and within minutes, the light rain had become a steady downpour that made the roads treacherous and visibility poor. The rain transformed the bike course into a test of survival rather than speed, and Marie found herself riding with the kind of caution that would have frustrated her competitive grandson but kept her upright and moving forward. Other athletes were pulling over to wait out the storm, but Marie pressed on, knowing that every minute counted toward the race's cutoff time. Her borrowed bike didn't have the best brakes, and she could feel the wheels slipping on the wet pavement as she navigated the descents. But something about the rain felt appropriate, like Tommy. was adding one final challenge to test her resolve. This is what you trained for, she told herself. Remembering all those early morning rides in Durango when the weather had been less than perfect. The rain soaked through her jersey, making her shiver, but her legs kept turning over with the mechanical persistence that had become second nature over 8 months of training. By the time she reached the transition area for the run, Marie was thoroughly soaked but still moving, and the clock showed 5 hours and 23 minutes, well behind the leaders. But still within the cutoff time, the transition to running was brutal, her legs feeling like concrete as she tried to find her rhythm on feet that had been clipped into pedals for nearly 4 hours. The rain had turned the run course into a muddy slog, and Marie's first few steps were awkward and painful as her body protested the change in motion. The half-marathon run course was an out and back along Boulder Creek, normally a scenic route, but now a test of mental toughness as much as physical endurance. Marie settled into the shuffling gait that had carried her through countless training runs, accepting that she'd never be fast, but knowing she could be persistent. The rain continued to fall, turning the dirt sections of the trail into slippery mud that claimed several runners, but Marie picked her way carefully through the worst sections, thinking about every step and remembering Coach Peterson's advice about staying upright being more important than going fast. At mile 3 of the run, her left calf cramped so severely that she had to stop and walk, massaging the muscle while other runners passed her with concerned looks. The cramp was a setback that Marie had feared but not prepared for, and she spent the next 2 miles alternating between running and walking, trying to find a pace that wouldn't trigger another muscle spasm. The rain was relentless now, soaking through her shoes and making every step a squelching reminder that she was attempting something far beyond her experience level. At the turnaround point of the run course, Marie saw the leaders already heading back toward the finish, their faces set in the grimaces of people pushing their bodies to the absolute limit. She was hours behind them, but she was still moving, still making forward progress toward a goal that had seemed impossible when she'd first made the promise to Tommy. "You're doing great," called out a spectator huddled under an umbrella. "Just keep moving forward." The encouragement gave Marie a boost of energy, and she managed to string together several minutes of consistent running before the cramp returned and forced her back to a walk. The final miles of the run became a battle between Marie's will and her body's limitations, played out on rain-soaked trails that had turned treacherous with mud and standing water. Her left leg was cramping regularly now, forcing her to stop every few minutes to massage the muscle, but she refused to consider dropping out. Tommy's race number was still pinned to her chest, and she could feel his presence with every labored step, encouraging her to keep going when her body wanted to quit. At mile 10 of the run, Marie realized she was going to finish barring a complete physical breakdown. She had enough time to cover the remaining 3.1 miles within the race's cutoff. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, and she started crying right there on the trail, tears mixing with rain and sweat as she contemplated the magnitude of what she was about to accomplish. A volunteer at the aid station noticed her emotional state and asked if she needed medical attention. "No," Marie replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm just thinking about my grandson. He'd be so proud right now." The final mile was a victory lap through downtown Boulder, where spectators lined the streets despite the rain, cheering for every finisher regardless of their time or place. Marie could hear the race announcer in the distance, calling out names and times, but all she could think about was Tommy and the promise she'd made in a hospital room 8 months earlier. Her legs were cramping, her body was exhausted, and she was running slower than she'd ever run before. But she was going to cross the finish line of the Boulder 70.3 Triathlon as a 69-year-old first-time triathlete. The final turn brought the finish line into view, and Marie could see the timing clock showing 8 hours and 47 minutes, well past the official cutoff time. But race officials were still there, still cheering, still celebrating every athlete who'd had the courage to start and the determination to finish. As she approached the line, Marie pulled Tommy's race number from her chest and held it high above her head. Crossing the finish line, not just for herself, but for the grandson who'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. The crowd erupted in cheers, but all Marie could hear was Tommy's voice whispering in her ear. "I knew you could do it, Abuela. I knew you were strong enough." The immediate aftermath of Marie's finish was a blur of emotions. Medical volunteers, and congratulations from strangers who'd been inspired by her journey. As she sat in the medical tent, wrapped in a space blanket and sipping hot broth, the reality of what she'd accomplished began to sink in. She'd completed a 70.3-mile triathlon at age 69. In the rain, with cramping legs and equipment that was older than some of the other competitors. The medal around her neck felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of everything it represented: months of training. The grief that had motivated her, the promise she'd kept to her grandson who would never know, she'd crossed the finish line. "Mrs. Douglas," said the race photographer, "we'd love to get a picture of you with your medal. Your story has been inspiring people all day." Marie nodded, thinking about Tommy, and wondering if he would have been proud of the time it took her to finish. Then realizing that he would have been proud simply because she'd refused to quit. The drive back to Durango the next morning gave Marie time to process the magnitude of her transformation over the past 8 months. She'd left town as a grieving grandmother, trying to honor a dying boy's wish. And she was returning as a triathlete who'd proven that age was just a number if you had the determination to ignore it. The medal sat on her passenger seat, catching the morning sunlight as she drove through the mountain passes that had become so familiar during her training. But more than the medal, more than the finish time, more than the congratulations she'd received, Marie carried with her the knowledge that she was capable of things she'd never imagined possible. At 69, she'd discovered a version of herself that was stronger, more determined, and more resilient than the woman who'd made a desperate promise in a hospital room. The grief over Tommy's death was still there, would always be there, but it had been transformed into something purposeful, something that honored his memory while creating new possibilities for her own life. Sarah was waiting in Marie's driveway when she pulled up, holding a homemade sign that read, "My mum is a triathlete," and the tears that both women shed were a mixture of joy, relief, and the kind of pride that comes from witnessing someone you love accomplish the impossible. "I'm sorry I doubted you," Sarah said as they hugged in the driveway. "Tommy would be so proud. He always said you were the strongest person he knew, and now I understand what he meant." The neighbors came out to congratulate Marie, Mrs. Patterson leading a small parade of people who'd been following her journey through the local newspaper coverage. Coach Peterson arrived with a bottle of champagne and a proposal that made Marie's heart skip. "The college team wants to adopt you as an honorary member. They want you to help train other athletes who think they're too old to chase their dreams." The idea that her journey could inspire others to pursue their own impossible goals was overwhelming. And Marie realized that finishing the triathlon had been just the beginning of something larger. The long-term impact of Marie's achievement rippled through Durango in ways she never anticipated. Local gym memberships among older adults increased by 40% in the months following her race. And the rec center started offering senior fitness classes specifically designed for people who wanted to try endurance sports. "You started something," Coach Peterson told her during one of their post-race conversations. "People are realizing that retirement doesn't have to mean the end of challenging yourself physically. You've shown them that 70 is just a number." Marie began speaking at local groups, sharing her story and encouraging others to find their own impossible goals, whether that was running a 5K, climbing a mountain, or simply taking daily walks. The message was always the same: it's never too late to discover what you're capable of, and the hardest part is usually just getting started. Tommy's death had created a hole in the community that would never be completely filled. But Marie's journey had transformed that loss into something that inspired others to live more fully. The most profound change in Marie's life was her relationship with grief itself. The daily training had given her a way to channel her sorrow into something constructive. And the completion of the triathlon had proved that love could motivate us to transcend our perceived limitations. She still missed Tommy every day. still wished she could call him and tell him about her race experience. But the grief no longer felt like a weight that was pulling her down. Instead, it had become a source of strength, a reminder that the people we love continue to influence our lives, even after they're gone. Tommy didn't die for nothing, she told Dr. Martinez during one of their follow-up sessions. His dream became my dream, and now maybe it'll become someone else's dream. That's how love works. It doesn't die with the person, it just finds new ways to express itself. The wisdom in those words surprised even Marie, who'd never considered herself particularly philosophical. But 8 months of pushing her body to its limits had also expanded her understanding of what was possible in every aspect of life. The universal message of Marie's journey resonated far beyond the boundaries of Durango or even Colorado, as her story spread through social media and triathlon communities across the country. She received letters from people in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s who'd been inspired to pursue their own athletic goals, proving that the human spirit doesn't recognize age limits if the motivation is strong enough. "You showed us that it's never too late to keep a promise," wrote one woman from Texas who'd started training for her first marathon at age 74. "You showed us that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story, that it can be the beginning of something beautiful." Marie kept every letter, understanding that her personal journey had somehow become a symbol of hope for anyone who'd ever been told they were too old, too slow, or too inexperienced to chase their dreams. The finish line in Boulder had been the end of one chapter, but it was also the beginning of a larger story about the power of love to transform loss into purpose, proving that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that seemed impossible when we started. ****